Thank you, everyone, for joining this, our final session of the Gene Drive Research Forum's Stakeholder Engagement Series. We've had a fantastic level of participation from across geographies and from across Gene Drive stakeholder groups during the live discussions of the previous 4 sessions, and today I see is no exception. And please note that if you missed any of the previous discussions, each was recorded and may be viewed on YouTube. My name is Karen Tudis, and I am from the Gene Convene Global Collaborative, an initiative at the Foundation for the NIH. And as many of you already know, this series was produced through a collaboration between Gene Convene and the Genetic Biocontrol of Invasive Rodents Partnership, more easily referred to as the G-BIRD Partnership. Let me take this last opportunity to thank my very able colleague and friend, Royden Saw of G-BIRD. This stakeholder engagement series is a product of his collaborative spirit and willingness to explore new ideas. Thank you, Royden, for taking the time to work with me, for taking the time to work with a number of stakeholders that we surveyed in the early planning phases of this series, and for taking time to work with the moderators and panelists to create and shape what has turned out to be a very stimulating series. Today, Royden and I thank Dr. Todd Kuiken, an environmental scientist and senior research scholar with the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University, for taking on the task of moderating the panel discussion. The topic for today, the independence of stakeholder engagement activities, is one that Todd has put a great deal of thought into. So he is the ideal moderator for this session. So with no further ado, I will turn the virtual floor over to you, Todd. Thank you very much.
So much, Karen, and good time of day to wherever you may be joining us from. As Karen mentioned, my name is Todd Kuiken. I'm a senior research scholar in the Genetic Engineering and Society Center here at NC State University. I would like to thank G-BIRD, FNIH, and Gene Convene for entrusting me with closing out this great webinar series with such a distinguished panel of guests today. We brought together a cohort of experts from different facets of stakeholder engagement to spark a dialogue about the independence of stakeholder engagement activities. After a brief introduction from the panelists, I'll begin the dialogue with a set of questions. We plan to leave about 30 minutes at the end to invite viewers of the webinar to submit your questions and join the dialogue. But please feel free to add comments to the chat during the discussion, and we will do our best to integrate those throughout the moderated portion of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to go around sort of our Hollywood squares here for folks to introduce themselves. And in my screen on the upper left, I have Delphine Thizy. So please go ahead and introduce yourself, Delphine.
Thank you, Todd. Good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Delphine Thizy. I'm a stakeholder engagement expert. I work for different clients, including Target Malaria, for whom I was the stakeholder engagement manager for a while. And I also work on advocacy issues with the Partnership to End Malaria. Thank you.
Next on my screen, we have Tom, if you could please introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Thomas Burnett. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Engagement and Communications at the John Templeton Foundation. My role is largely to straddle the academic and journalism worlds, looking to extract interesting insights, potential story ideas from the ivory tower and try to bring it to the public square.
Thanks, Thomas. Next, we'll go to Francine.
Hi, everybody. I'm Francine Madden, the Executive Director of the Center for Conservation Peacebuilding. We act as a third-party neutral. We intervene in deep-rooted, complex conflicts in the natural resource world.
Thank you, Francine. And last, but certainly not least, we'll go to Cristina for an introduction.
Thanks, Todd, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Christina Morarooni. I'm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'm the Regional Director for the Wildlife Conservation Society's Rocky Mountain Program. And our work is really, at its core, very much centered in stakeholder engagement. We might use different language about that, but hopefully we can talk about that soon. But we're a conservation organization. We've been around for 125 years. And this is one of 14 regional programs around the world.
Great, thanks so much. So I wanted to start off with Thomas, actually. As we know, stakeholder engagement activities, or the various terminologies for that, usually require resources. And so one of the reasons we wanted to invite you to this seminar is if you could give us sort of a, why is it that you're interested in stakeholder engagement from your foundation's perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start off by saying that I think most of the funding from the Templeton Foundation goes towards basic research. And I think everyone listening in here knows the value and impact basic research in the sciences has had for society. But at the same time, only a tiny fraction of humanity engages in research. And we think at the same time that everyone can benefit from exploring science and the big questions of life. And so we've got a portion of our funding is committed to the sort of broader public engagement initiatives. We have identified 5 very specific audiences within the general public that we try to reach, and we look for talented intermediaries who have the trust of those audiences and the ability to engage with them in rich, deep ways. And so we try to do both the basic research support as well as that engagement with the broader community.
And I might follow up with Cristina, if you could maybe talk a little bit about, how your program and your own work accomplishes stakeholder engagement, in a sense, or where are you getting those resources from? And if you could also talk about maybe how Wildlife Conservation Society either supports that work and why they're supporting that work.
Yeah, 100%. It's really interesting because when I took on this role about 3 years ago, and one of the many goals that we had was to really change conservation, to create a new conservation paradigm for the 21st century. And part of what we recognized was that in order to do that, there's a whole lot of smart people out there that need to be spoken to, entered into a relationship with in order to inform what we do. And that work sort of falls in 2 areas primarily. It really spans everything that we do, but in the first instance, working lands, private lands, ranching and farming land. And we needed and wanted to deepen our engagement with the ranching community to inform how we design conservation strategy, how you could create more inclusive, more enduring conservation outcomes. And similarly, a long history of engagement with Indigenous communities. And so similarly, wanted to really deepen the conversation, the partnership, the relationship with tribal nations that we're working with. WCS was super supportive of this. We have a long history of sort of conservation that's community driven, community based, and informed through deep partnership with communities around the world. So that wasn't a stretch at all. And luckily, for whatever reason, the funders that I have in my program deeply believe in this vision of creating a new conservation paradigm. And that in order to do that, we really need to do conservation in a very different way and sort of hold equity and justice at the center so that we are inclusive, so that we create enduring outcomes. So luckily I got the thumbs up all around, and we're in the thick of it in terms of engagement.
Great, so I'd like to maybe get Delphine on your thoughts on this, and then Francine, I'm going to come to you after that because I think you bring a very different perspective to this as well. So Delphine, you've obviously had lots of experience in stakeholder engagement from different perspectives. So could you talk a bit about where you've either searched for resources for this, but also if you can give us some examples of other engagement activities where in essence the funding was already there from a particular place you were working.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important here to distinguish maybe the community engagement, so trying to engage the villages, the participants that might be directly affected by a research project, and then the broader stakeholder group, and all the way to what the National Academy refers to as the public. Because I think in this you will find that the funding is often quite different. So in my experience, the funding to engage communities is often and should be built into the core funding of research. Because if you are to develop any particular intervention, whether gene drive for public health or conservation activities, engaging those that will be directly impacted positively or negatively by your intervention is core to ethical requirements, to regulatory requirements of carrying out this research. And my feeling is this should be built in your normal grant proposal. When you're coming to the broader public discussion, especially when you're dealing with a new technology or new type of intervention, it's a bit more complex because that public is less sometimes less directly related to your intervention. So if I take the example of target malaria, their community are African villages, but their large public might be located on other continent where malaria is not as much of a direct threat. And so the engagement of that public has different objectives. You're no longer looking for an agreement on a particular intervention, but you might be looking for a general public debate and public dialogue. And there, the funding often is a bit more difficult because it doesn't feel like it's a necessity for the research to advance. So usually those funding are more difficult. That being said, I have seen and heard colleagues from other projects who have been struggling to have funding for core engagement with communities when they were in very early stage of research, being told that, develop something in the lab and then we'll see. And I think most practitioners and ethicists would say that this is not appropriate. Funding for engagement should be really coming really early into project cycle.
So Francine, I'm curious if you could kind of, one of the reasons we wanted to bring you back again, one, because you were so great the last time, but in terms of the work that you do, my understanding is that usually people are coming to you and sort of hiring you. So could you kind of discuss a little bit about sort of, who those people are and why they're coming to you in terms of providing you the resources to do the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you, Todd. So my organization, I run a very small nonprofit organization. Our approach is conflict transformation. So our approach is we go deep into the conflict, so that us versus them, very polarizing group versus group conflict. We also so that we go deep, we go wide to take a systems approach, because whatever that dispute is, whatever that issue is at hand that people say, hey, we need a stakeholder engagement around, that's really a microcosm of the societal conflicts going on in the larger society. And so taking a systems approach when you're addressing this specific issue is really critical. And then, so going wide and then going long. So all of these issues that we work on, I work on conservation, whether you're working on social equity, whether you're working on your gene drive stuff, all of this has to do with, it's the infinite game, right? This is all about long-term resilience and endurance in that system with these different actors in that system. So we're a nonprofit. We have largely been a fee-for-service nonprofit, and there's costs and benefits to that, which I hope we get into. But so the way that works is that a client, and it's usually the one that's most under the gun, has the most pressure, is the most under attack, or has the biggest lift, is trying to achieve the biggest outcome. They're usually desperate when they come to us because they have to be ready for the kind of approach that we're willing to take. We don't go in and say, hey, we're going to just facilitate the big meeting. That's not the approach we take. We take a really deep dive into that system. We go vertical, kind of what Delphine was talking about. There's lots of different layers in that system, and then we go broad in that system. So I need the mandate and permission to do what I do so that I can create the conditions in that system to turn what is often a vicious cycle of conflict into a virtuous cycle of shared problem solving and a capacity for continued engagement. So we will get calls for people and they'll say, hey, can you come in? And I will say, okay, well, what's my mandate? What is the space that I have? And if I can't if I don't have the space or the mandate, and a lot of times that's funding limited, and a lot of times that is sort of knowledge, like society's capacity to know what does it mean to have a good process. So I'll turn that case down because I'll say, we're not going to do it, because what's going to happen is you can get a decision at the end of the day, but then after that, your relationships may fall apart. You won't have the processes, you won't have that capacity embedded in the system to continue to adapt whatever your solutions are through time. So we're kind of unique, I guess, in that way. We turn down a lot of cases because we are really looking for the right conditions to come in to be as effective as possible. And so that when we pull out of that system continues to move in that virtuous cycle. And I'm going to just say that there's gaps in that because, but I'll pause from there because I'm hoping we'll talk about the bigger funding needs in doing the work that we're trying to do, because I think well, I'll stop there.
Great. So I think that's a nice segue in terms of at least how I've been approaching this, which is to move us kind of into the interest portion, right? In terms of what is the interest of funders or other groups in stakeholder engagement. So Thomas, I'd love to turn it to you to either comment on what Francine said, but also more generally, I mean, Templeton is a really fascinating foundation from my perspective in terms of the breadth of what you guys fund. And so I wonder if you could talk a bit about the interest of the Templeton Foundation in terms of that breadth of funding and what they're hoping to get from that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's always good to ask on the big picture, what does the foundation hope to do? And I think you can split it into two groups. I think we'd like to see more religious communities be enthusiastic and engaged with scientific inquiry. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to be excited about. We'd also like to see science enthusiasts become more curious about philosophical questions, theological questions, the other kinds of questions that are really difficult to quantify and measure, but are nevertheless vital for human flourishing. So we push on two fronts, which is hard to do because sometimes you get pot shots from groups that they really like one part of your mission, but they really dislike the other part. And so it's kind of hard to fight on two fronts, but I think if we're going to make big strides really as a society, we need to be pushed on the frontiers of knowledge in all dimensions and not just focus narrowly in certain areas where we feel comfortable. I think it's important to feel uncomfortable because that's the only way we can grow. So that's sort of the big picture there.
Yeah, Francine, go ahead.
Tom, that was just such a beautiful segue. Thank you. So this idea of pushing on the frontier of society, right? And like really pushing us to be more innovative and everything. This is where, and I've been like wrestling with this as we had our first conversation and we're talking about this issue. And I was like, why is this panel happening, right? And a lot of it what we're going to be talking about is this independence of funding. And is that important and why? And so I've been wrestling with this and realizing that issue of independence of funding is really a symptom of what I think is a deeper challenge, opportunity, problem around funding. So think about it like this. So like what Tom said, and I agree, like Templeton, just heard of you, really cool stuff. You're funding this basic science, right? So if you let's look at this issue of conflict transformation, stakeholder engagement, whatever you want to call it. There's research that is like pulling off pieces of the puzzle, right? If you think about what does it mean to get a society to function, it's about getting all these puzzle pieces together, right? So what's important is to understand each individual puzzle piece. But then I think what's missing in this whole world of funding, there's looking at the different puzzle pieces, and then there's this giant gap. And then you have people who are out there as a third party neutral, as a convener, as whatever you want to call it. And they're out there just doing their practice. But what's missing is this center, bigger piece, which is ensuring that there's a standard of practice in third party neutrals and conveners. It's ensuring that there is a community that is continually growing pushing itself, advancing, innovating, testing. The gap is, I think, between the science and the practice. So my analogy for this is, let's say you're doing cancer research, right? And you're saying, hey, what's going to kill these cancer cells? So you have your Petri dish, right? And you say, let's try this thing and we'll see if this kills cancer cells, right? That's great. That is important basic research. That's the puzzle, one puzzle piece. But you don't go from, oh, look, this thing killed this cancer cell, and then jump to, this is how we're going to treat cancer patients. There was a whole process in there in patient care, in how to adapt and integrate the whole package of what it means to take care of this patient and address the cancer, so that at the end of the day, you have a healthy patient. Now, take this at a societal level, take this at stakeholder engagement, conflict transformation, again, whatever term you want to use to do what we're all trying to do well. And I think the gap is in there, is in, we are not creating a standard of practice. We are not building and advancing the capacity of people doing this work. And the result of that is people get turned off to collaboration, they get turned off to stakeholder engagement, and they get turned off to each other. And then we say, and what happens is then one symptom is that people say, well, that funding came from X foundation, and so the neutral party, the convener, was biased, right? But that is a symptom of the fact that that convener didn't have the capacity, the full range of capacity to do that system engagement, to put in place that neutral process in a way that built a neutral process that everybody could trust. And so that, I think that gap that's a huge gap in funding. And then that goes back to, so what do we fund? We fund the basic research. And then the other thing we do is we say, okay, this issue is really important. Either in my case, it's usually really controversial, or for you guys, you're like, whoa, well, actually maybe controversial as well. But then we fund projects, and then we're like, well, gosh, who could we get to do this? But because there's no standard of practice in people like me who do this stuff, then you don't really know what you're getting. And because society, funders, clients, et cetera, don't often know what it means to put in place a good process, everybody's kind of moving around blind, hoping that they get something that's going to be good. But sometimes people don't even know what it is they're getting.
That's really fascinating. I hope we can come back to maybe how to fix that or solve that, or at least give some steps towards that. Delphine, I see you have your hand up, so please go ahead.
And I don't know whether I want to react to Tom or Francine, because there's so much to unpack. But I think one thing I find interesting is about this ability to innovate on engagement, or on how we relate to community. And I think in this, there's two approaches, right? And so there's the approach where you sit down, you have experts in social science, and they sit and they come up with a great framework, and then you try that framework and you see if it works, you improve, you make more papers, etc. And then you have another approach where you say, okay, now we'll take practitioners, they know how to do that, they do their work, but then question of, oh, have they built any, how have they learned from the experience? Have they built any framework that others can use? And how do you leverage the learning that happens throughout the way? So I think my experience in the engagement forum in Gene Drive has been a bit of a mix, and I think that's what you're saying, Francine. What I'm hearing is this need to kind of bridge that. So getting the amazing academic that have been thinking about theories, who confront that with the practitioners who have been learning, who have been innovating in their practice and trying to confront on almost a daily fashion, what are the challenges of implementing this in a village where you might have 5-6 different languages, a different governance system that might be different from what most academics are, who are, with all respect, in North America. So how do you confront all that, and how do you try to get all this learning from the field and bring that to good practices? And so a few of us in Gene Drive Research have been trying to reach out to other people who work on public health and area-wide control, and see how we can bring those learnings and confront that with the theoretical models and with the existing guidelines like we have from WHO and others. But I agree with you, there's this gap in how you learn and how funding is adapted to this too, because often you're either a research project or you're a practitioner, and then you don't have that much time or money to actually fund this reflection and the writing of all these papers that you need to back up those learnings.
Cristina, I see your hand up as well. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And I would like to spend the entire day with all of you. So many really fascinating ideas, thoughts, provocative questions being posed here. And something that I want to circle back to is something you said, Delphine, about sort of the end goal or the why. About the why in our work. And the why, in some cases, is really determined by the funding community. Certainly in the conservation space, and mostly through the lens of conservation funders, the why is really about designation. You know, the end goal is, can you get more land into a protected area status in order to ensure durability? And we sort of comport ourselves into knots to try and do that, but do the work in the right way. And so, you know, as I was thinking about, you know, the fabulous partners in the funding community that we do have, if I'm really honest about it, what I'm most intrigued by in terms of working with different interest groups or stakeholders or partners is transformational change. You know, conservation has, in my time in conservation over 25 years, I got started working with fishing communities, so rural communities. And what I've watched is conservation become so polarizing, so divisive, you know, whether that's rural, urban, native, non-native, you know, white, brown. I mean, it's just all about divides. And I think to Francine's point, it just speaks to systemic problems. And if we don't have the resources to tackle this conflict, these divisions in a systemic way, we're just chipping away. And in some cases, I actually think making the problem worse because we're rushing to the solution. And so, you know, for me, the reason why I'm really interested in this conversation and the funding connection to it is, you know, it's a very colonized model of funding that we have. And therefore, the types of solutions that we are working towards with our partners, even though we try to do it the right way, still are kind of colonized constructs. And so I dream about the idea of partnering with Francine to solve some of these issues that I see over and over in my work, but I don't have the resources to really go deep and really apply kind of a systemic methodology to this work so that, you know, take wolves in New Mexico. You know, Mexican wolves got reintroduced a long time ago. Every year, 1/3 of them are killed. Ethically, what are we doing reintroducing wolves when we haven't done the systemic work to ensure that they aren't slaughtered? That's on us. So I really struggle with that. We've got this opportunity to rewild jaguars in the same region. Do I do that if I don't find resources to partner with Francine to really get at these conflicts, these divisions that doesn't matter the species, it's really about identity and a million other things that Francine can tell me about. But it has to do with psychology and culture and history and all these really entrenched racism, most likely, with my buffalo work. So I think there's a whole kind of decolonizing of conservation and philanthropy that I think that in many ways is at the root of, at least in my world, of getting to investment in stakeholder engagement that is transformational and really systemic in its output.
Great. Francine, I see your hand up, but I want to jump to Thomas real quick to maybe comment on what Cristina said, because I think, and I may have this wrong, but it seems to me anyway that Templeton might be thinking about funding in that holistic manner. But if I have that wrong, just tell me I'm wrong. But maybe if you could talk about how, you know, at least your foundation thinks about these issues in that holistic way.
I guess one thing I'd say is that we recognize that people who do the research are experts in research and not necessarily experts in communicating it or sharing it more broadly. And so we are just as picky in terms of choosing which experts will do which projects, as well as picky about which intermediaries do which projects. And so I think this goes back to, I think maybe what Francine was saying. There is a wide range of quality in terms of intermediaries who are, doing their best to try to engage certain stakeholders. And there's a certain level of experience that my colleagues and I, those who've been here longer, have learned who does stuff well and really who doesn't. And there's a certain level of trust building between funders and practitioners that has to be built over time. There's a lot of people asking for money, and there's strikingly few who can deliver on what they promise in their proposals. So say in terms of going back to your question of sort of holistic type work, we just have to be just as savvy of funding engagement type work as we do research. And so I think we have within our own foundation specialists in being able to suss out who's going to do engagement well, as well as academic specialists who know the ins and outs of physics and biology and psychology and anthropology. There's just, I think it's really underappreciated how much expertise or lack thereof is in doing that sort of third party, sort of intermediary type work. There's his own level of expertise that I think certainly doesn't get the status that research does, but the degree of professionalism is just as important. And I think our years of doing that, we've made good choices and we've made bad choices, and try to have that institutional knowledge of learning from mistakes and rewarding those who do well with new projects and new grants.
Okay, Francine, go ahead.
Wow, I had all this stuff to add after Christina. I was like, oh yeah, Cristina. Now I'm like, oh wow, Tom. It's like being in a candy store. Okay, so I think there is, just starting with where Tom was at, so when I look at what we do is conservation conflict transformation, and it ranges, there's multiple disciplines in there, ranging from neurology, so literally what happens to our brain on conflict, all the way up through complex system theory, and all of that, dynamics and all that, right? And it's everything in between. So there's like a couple dozen disciplines in there. What we do, my organization prioritizes pulling that science. And getting to Tom's point is like, there's a lot of, there's variability in that. So we pull what works, right? Those human sciences, and then we figure out how do we adapt that in practice, right? And going back to what Cristina said, our world has changed dramatically in the last 20, 30, 40 years. We are not operating in the same system that some of these conflict resolution, interest-based negotiation, those approaches were developed 30, 40 years ago when we lived in a completely and radically different world. So if we are not continually adapting and advancing and integrating good human sciences, again, that goes from the individual, even deeper than psychology, but literally neurologically, what happens to our brain on conflict, all the way up through how do complex systems change and evolve over time. And we're not integrating those, right? So part of what we do as CPeace, as the Center for Conservation Peacebuilding, is we borrow that research, and then we sit there and we take it, we play with it, right? I think play is a missing piece in all of this, right? We play with it, we practice, we test things out. And I think there is a lack of recognition as well, is that every conflict, every intervention that we do, we have to design processes that are context specific to that specific issue, to those people, to that culture, to what's happening in the system at that time. So if I were to go in, it'd be like going into a river, right? If you go into a river at point A, it may be a windy river, maybe flying, going really fast, but strong current. But if you go at B, it may be really slow. It may have widened out, right? But time, systems, all of that are constantly evolving. And if we're not evolving our practice and drawing from the science, but here's the nut here is that imagine the resources and the work that is needed and that I think is missing, right? So I'm off in my corner doing this, and I'm learning from people. I'm like, oh, pull from this anthropologist here, this political scientist here, this neurologist here, this complexity science here. But I'm kind of doing that in my own little world. How much better would we be if we were able to have these kinds of conversations and I could learn how other people are innovating their world and what research they're pulling from. And there was research on the puzzle piece. How do you put that puzzle piece together? What does that look like? Because like when Delphine was talking about a framework, like we rest on a set of theories, principles, processes, and skills, and then we create a framework that fits for that context at that point in time. And there's underlying conditions and themes in there, but I think part of what has made stakeholder engagement not work in a lot of areas is people learn one way to do things, they don't advance, and then they have a cookie cutter approach where they just say, okay, we're gonna, underfund something. We're going to slam this square peg into the round hole because we developed this thing back when square pegs were the thing. But today we're in round hole world. So we need but they're not doing that. And so what's happening is that stakeholder engagement falls short of the real potential and possibility that it can create in the world that we have. So we don't have the receptivity, and we think we are, as Cristina said, we are an incredibly polarized world. Well, that's where we need to start. We need to start with reconciling that deep-rooted conflict, with recognizing that all these issues that we care about are really just disputes. They are tangible physical manifestations of what is going on in society. And so if we attempt to divorce our actions, right, our interventions from what's going on in society, then we fail. And that's where you get what the model that I think Cristina is very accurately pointed to, which is it becomes this top-down, imposing, it's my way or the highway. Even if you say, well, we have a process, we're bringing in stakeholders, but those stakeholders feel like they're a checkbox. They do not feel, you can say it's inclusive, but if they don't feel like it's inclusive, it's not, et cetera, et cetera. So, wow, lots of good stuff here.
Delphine, I see your hands up, and then I might have a controversial question for us to unpack.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, well, I think one thing that I feel is maybe missing here is how we ground this work. And in my experience, whether it's been on malaria or previously in NGO work or in mining, I've always felt I've done this work for more than 15 years now, but I've always felt that unless you work with stakeholder engagement, or whatever we call them, community engagement, conflict resolution experts, they need to have a stake in the game, and so they need to know the society you're speaking about. So I've heard a lot about the question of the colonial science and so on, and I think these are very important. But one way to ground us and to avoid that is also to make sure that the collaborations are taking place with people who are actually have stake in the game and know very well this society, because no matter how long we're going to work there and with all the great science and whatever, all the papers we can read, there is nothing that will be the same as the engagement from those experts, because they are at the same time experts, but they're also themselves stakeholders in the research. And I've seen this in a very different framework with the Rollback Malaria Partnership on how they do advocacy for malaria, and the strengths of having malaria affected families doing their own advocacy, engaging their own community into how we look at solution, what should we consider, and that has a very different weight. And so I feel that as researchers from North America or from Europe, our role is to see how we can accompany those great researchers and those great practitioners and help them raise their voice, because often they do have a lot of innovation, but they're just not heard because of how the research is funded and how some of this research funding is often channeled. And so there is really a role for us to be advocating champions for these colleagues and for their innovation and capacity.
So I want to unpack that a little bit, because this theme has come up, I think, a couple of times about how do we get that knowledge base, or those different types of knowledge, particularly for people on the ground who are doing this type of engagement and conflict resolution work, either into a standardized process, as Francine was mentioning, or just out into the world in terms of how people could better do this. And I think we had this conversation privately, but it gets to this question about, in essence, like, who really should be doing this type of work. And in my perspective, I mean, I sit in an academic institution, so I'm wondering actually if academia is actually not where this should be happening, right? Like, I see there's lots of academic papers written by academics about stakeholder engagement. They're getting a lot of the funding from my perspective. But hearing from people actually on the ground, like, is that actually the right model, right? Should academics, right, be the ones sort of leading the charge in this, in terms of, Francine, what you're talking about, putting the models out there, even if they're old or they're not actually actually engaged in this type of activity on the ground. So I wonder if, I'm just going to throw that out there, both, to Thomas as well, in terms of, who you look towards to fund this type of work, but then also, to Delphine, Francine, and Cristina about, on the ground, even, are the people you're interacting with, do they care, right? Who's doing the engagement work? Like, do they care about these broader questions that we're talking about where the money comes from? But at the core of that is really about, I'll just put it bluntly, is academia getting in the way of doing effective public engagement? So I'm going to throw that out there for whoever wants to jump on that first. Jump in.
Ooh, okay. I'll get my little hand down here. So I don't think it's an either or. I think there is a powerful role for academia to be partnered with practitioners, right? So you're doing this research, but you're ground truthing it with what's really going on in that system, with what's the practical reality. So I think there is value, absolute value in both. I can only speak in the natural resource conservation world. Maybe I can't, but that's my area. So I'll just say that I think there is an inherent bias in our field, where there's the biology, the ecology, right? Like, whatever that is, the science, the hard science, we know what that, society knows what that needs to look like. There's a high standard there, right? If you're doing a peer-reviewed journal, the editors of that know what to look for in that. Now flip over to, these so-called soft sciences, right? That make up, the work, like, for instance, some of the work that I do. People with a biological or ecological background will postulate on what a stakeholder engagement needs to look like. And because they have the hard science credentials, they are getting a pass to publish on what's going to resolve conflict, what's going to transform that conflict. And that's where I think the danger is at. And so the conversation that Todd is referring to is where, there's peer-reviewed literature on what does it mean to do stakeholder engagement. And I've looked at these models, and they don't work. They're not based in the human sciences of what does it mean to really bring people together, but they're getting published. And when I go to them and I say, hey, I'm like, have you ever actually tried this model? And they're like, oh no, I'm absolute crap at doing conflict. I'm like, then why did you publish it? And they're like, because I think it's important. So I think it's great that they think it's important. I think we need people to champion this, that it's important. But this is where the standard of practice is. I don't think we should all be doing it the same way. I think we should be learning from one another. There should be a rich, robust academic practitioner to practitioner, community to practice. That's something that we're building in CPeace, but it's going to take more than just our organization to do it. But the reality is, I think there's wonderful academic practitioner partnerships, but we have to recognize the implicit biases in our field against one side or the other. And we need to make sure that we are applying a higher standard of practice to the kind of work that I'm doing and that many of us are doing, so that we're not actually causing harm. We need to be operating by a do no harm principle. And I think unless we're really being rigorous about the work that we're doing, unless we're really reflecting on the work that we're doing, and we're making sure that we're doing it to a high standard of practice, which I don't think exists across the field because it's not being demanded. And I think there's a role for funding in that as well.
Delphine, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Sorry, going next again. But I think this is right, and it has to be said. So in the project where I work in target malaria, we had a large team in Africa, but very few academic, and I'm myself a practitioner, as I wouldn't pretend being an academic. And I think this can go as far, but at some point to build legitimacy for how you do the engagement, for the results of your engagement, the world we live in, whether it's fair or not, is asking you to publish. And so that's where collaboration with academic or trying to find systems to help colleagues who might not have access to those publications to publish their results, because they have a lot to communicate, but they need allies to raise their voice and bring this rich experience from the field and confront that to some of the example, as Francine mentioned, of some of the theories that might not have been tried. So I think there is a need for this alliance, and maybe for better communication. And I've always found, I mean, I won't name names of conferences, but I've always found that the very little space that's left for engagement issues in conferences, for instance, in public health, is appalling, because you go there, you go to sessions that have nothing to do with engagement, you go to vector control or vaccine or whatever, and all people talk about is how they're facing issues with communities or how they're trying different things, but you can never get a proper space to discuss that in those conferences. And so if any one of those conferences listening in, I think you need to open your door for more discussion and consider that practitioners can also bring lessons and can confront that with academic, even if they haven't had 50 publications in Nature before.
So, Cristina, I'd like to turn to you and then Thomas on a similar question, but a bit different. Well, and it gets back, I think, to this independence question from, the money in term, or also the interest in the outcomes. And so, what is that relationship, right? That between, say, the funder or like a wildlife conservation society, right, who is in essence supporting the work you're doing, but I would guess also has an interest in the outcome. And so I wonder if you could talk a bit about your experiences in the work you've done, of what that balance is, or whether there's a conflict there. And then also if the people that you're actually engaging with, if they care about that, right? Because again, like we talk a lot about this sort of independence and clean versus dirty money. And so I'm curious though, if that actually comes up when you're actually doing engagement with those communities around the issue. And then I'd like to talk, turn it to Thomas as well to kind of, unpack again about this interest question and the outcomes of what you're funding.
It's a really, really great question, Todd. And I think there's probably 10,000 questions packed in that as well. But first of all, just to speak to the WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society question, one of the things that's really amazing about the organization is that we as regional directors have a lot of freedom in terms of designing our strategies. What we do, where, with whom is really up to the regional director. The flip side of that is also that we raise all our own money, essentially. So hence, you hope to God you have a lot of freedom. So that's sort of that initial question that you asked. But I think what I'm hearing in your question is something that I think is really important, and something that Thomas already mentioned, and that's really the importance in the funding community to ensure, and it makes total sense, that basically for every dollar you invest, you are able to realize what your goal is as a funder, therefore really making sure that your investment has a positive return on investment, right? That that grantee delivers on the outputs and the outcomes that they promised in their proposal, in the grant agreement. And I think and that makes total sense. And I sort of operate the same way within my program. You know, my staff have to deliver on their goals and the outcomes and the outputs. And we spend a lot of time talking about theory, you know, what a good strategy is, et cetera. I think one of the real challenges or disconnect, and I'm really curious actually to have a conversation with Thomas about this, is, you know, we're talking about transformational change. We're talking about systemic change. There's so many moving parts. There's so many unknowns. And we all come with assumptions and blind spots and the lack of a 360. And so, you know, part of what I think a lot about is what are transformational metrics that we can use to hold ourselves to account, but that also really inspire the kind of play, to use Francine's word. I think that's huge. The play, the experimentation, the willingness to fail, because if we're really honest, I think oftentimes we learn more by failure than success. And I think there isn't a lot of conversation about that. And I especially think about it in the realm of what we're talking about here and some of the early questions about, you know, how do you bridge across these different disciplines? What is the role of academia, the practitioner, et cetera? You know, and I think a lot about science. You know, we're a science-based organization, and part of what my team really wrestles with a lot is, do we invest in new data generation? Do we invest in analysis and synthesis? Or do we invest in translation? And for me, when I think about transformational change, I think actually let's invest in the synthesis, analysis, and translation. There's a lot of data out there. How do we use it? How do we drive it to change? And then how do we measure impact? And how do we make sure that we're asking the right questions, both in terms of the research that we do, but also in terms of impact? And, you know, I just wonder, you know, Templeton, you all invest in storytelling, right? You invest in that translation. I listen to On Being. It's sort of like my own, I don't know, it's my inspiration, my thought provocation, my who I want to be when I grow up. But how do you measure the impact of that, right? It had a huge impact on me, but how? Like, I don't even know. So I know I'm throwing probably 10,000 questions and comments back at you, Todd, but hopefully that vaguely answers your question, or at least for 10,000 more.
But that's the whole point of this, is to just spark more questions. So Thomas, I wonder if you could, you know, either comment on what I said or actually what Cristina was discussing as well.
Sure. Just to respond to the last point, I think anecdotally, most people that know Templeton Foundation have probably heard about it through On Being. Krista Tippett is a real force of nature. She's consistent, she's professional, she's been at this for decades and has that professionalism and passion that we look for. I think we've been involved in funding her for probably close to 20 years, both specific sort of project grants as well as sponsorships. And I think John Templeton Foundation itself has benefited tremendously by our relationship with her. I think from our vantage point, a lot of times we talk about how, you know, organizations are so dependent on funding, but we don't talk as much about how funders themselves are dependent on high quality applicants, on grantees who know what they're doing and do what they say they're going to do. There is a reciprocal dependency. Our funding is only as good as the grantees that conduct their projects. And so in terms of that original question of stakeholders caring about who funds the work, we do our due diligence to identify trusted, respected, competent groups. I feel like so much rides on that. And that's really where our efforts, where we have something to contribute, is in discerning who should be doing this work. And so and then we're very much dependent on them. Once that grant agreement signed and the ink is dried, our hands are off. they do the work, and then it reflects back on us. But they then have the power once their grants are funded. So there is a sort of reciprocal reliance on each other. One relies on funds, the other's relies on performance and expertise and trust, which is, those things are really hard to cultivate, and money doesn't translate into those components that are so essential. We expect and rely on people who've been developing those for years and decades before we encounter them.
Good. I'm going to turn it over to Francine in a second. I just want to encourage folks out there listening and watching to please submit your questions into the chat. We've got a couple that we're going to turn to after we hear from Francine. So please start joining the dialogue, put your questions in there or comment on what folks are saying so we can start that dialogue. Francine, go ahead, please.
So to this point about independence of funding and how important is that and all that kind of stuff. So as I said earlier, I said my organization is often hired by the party that either has the biggest lift or is under attack the most, right, for whatever they're doing. So I come in already associated with often the most targeted entity in that system. So when I get my mandate permission, as I come in to Royden, who works for Island Conservation, his boss hired me for an intervention in the Galapagos. And when he hired me, and he loves to tell this story, I said, you can pay me, but I don't work for you. I work for the system. And so my goal, my job is to establish my neutrality and my inclusivity from the very beginning. So the expectation right up front is I don't work for the client, I work for that entire system. Everything from the contract to everything I do to the confidentiality of our work, everything is I work for the system. So that separates me from whoever is funding me, because I don't, that becomes irrelevant. And then what happens is they trust me, the stakeholders who are all fighting each other, trust me, and they trust the process that I put in place. To the issue of sort of objectives and all that kind of stuff, one of the things that I think is a risk that a client will take in bringing us on is I say, we'll see what happens. When you work in a complex system, you have to allow for emergence. And what we do when we can work in that larger system is we create as kind of a positive social contagion or a ripple effect where we may come in on one issue, but we're creating positive change throughout elements of that society. So when I was brought in on the predator conflict in the US, it was focused on that predator, but it created change on that predator, created positive change around another predator, around how science was being used in education, or around sexual abuse, around domestic animal abuse, a whole bunch of different things that rippled out throughout that system. Because again, we're doing a system engagement and we're allowing for that emergence. We're not keeping our focus, even if our client has a narrow goal, our goal is broader, because if we have a high functioning society, if we have a system that can function in a virtuous, positive direction, then you don't really know what's going to come out. Cool stuff's going to come out, but it can't be so I have to pull away from what the client wants. So this example in the Galapagos, the client wanted ecological restoration and eradication of invasive species. I was like, great, that's what you want. What does the community want, right? And so I designed something that was inclusive of all the needs, and everybody got actually completely what they wanted. And that allows you to turn a community that's radically against what you are trying to advocate for to getting that full embrace of what it is that you want, because it's tied to all these other things. The who does this kind of thing comment that came up, we do a lot of, in CPs, we do a lot of capacity building in conflict transformation, because people like Cristina who are in their system and are trying to move balls forward in her system and create that transformational change, she is more important ultimately than myself as a third-party neutral. I might come in and do something, but we always leave that capacity in the system because it's what we call the insider partials, right? I'm an outsider neutral. She's an insider partial. Those people are the most important people in that system because they're the ones who are going to carry that change forward throughout time. So if you don't embed the capacity in that system and the process structures to continue that adaptation over time, then it's going to be a waste of your resources to bring anybody in like myself. And then I just want to say that the failure thing, like I've given keynote addresses at conferences and I'm like, make your next conference on failure and I will lead the charge, but because we are not embracing failure enough and nobody's taken me up on it. So I don't know, we're all talking about it, but nobody's actually doing it. I'm like, really, like I'll go through every single failure because we do learn from that failure. And I think, but in sympathy to some of what, or empathy to some of what we're doing, is the stakes are so high, resources are so scarce. The stakes are high for communities, for their way of life, their identity, for wildlife species on the brink, whatever it is, whether it's technology stuff, right? The stakes are so high that nobody wants to risk failure, but then they fail and then they're afraid to look at that failure because they're too busy trying to sell to their funders why they're a success. So I think this is another role for funders, is in embracing that failure very genuinely, providing that long-term funding that allows people to engage in the play, to have those short, quick, fail smart kind of engagements. Okay, there's more monitoring evaluation, but I'm going to be quiet.
So Delphine, I'll turn it over to you, and then I'm going to turn to the questions we're getting in the chat.
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually agree with Francine. So I personally don't believe in neutral engagement. I think there's no such thing, but my experience with communities and with stakeholders is they care more about the process. So I believe that you can have a process that is fair and that brings you procedural legitimacy, where you might hear what your client or what your project wants to hear. You might achieve those outcomes, but you also are putting a process by which opposing views and communities might express things that the client really disagrees. And so I used to work in extractive industries, and so I was hired by the extractive industries. So I would never, could never call myself neutral. But in the way we would set up the processes, making sure that you have transparency and making sure that you do really create a two-way dialogue. That is the way that, for me, you create this. Maybe neutrality is really not the word that I like, but this more objectivity where you can really reflect these two aspects and create the trust. Because I think unless you can engage with that, your system is legitimate and that they can find reassurance about the trust, about values and respect, they won't engage. And I think in this, I really agree with you, Francine. And the other point that I think is very important is how you embed, when you take third party to help you or consultant to help you, it's really essential to have these people embedded. And that's usually, for instance, the case in, and I see there's a question on that subject a bit, when you do and those are called independents, though again, they're contracted by the project, but when you do an impact assessment, which is usually regulatorily required, you have this system by which the consultants are doing the impact assessment, but they have to work with someone in the project to make the change. Because if you're completely neutral, some academic have proposed, if you have a completely neutral engagement, it's very hard for this to be transformative for the project and for the research that you're proposing, because then you get this report where you don't feel it's really engaging or committing you to make any change. So I'm for a more embedded process where the respect and trust can be built through a process that is seen as legitimate by the stakeholders.
Thanks for that, Delphine. So I'm going to take us back a little bit. One of the questions we got in the chat is, I think, responding a bit to Francine and others, but it's about, that mechanism of how you get those efforts on the ground documented. And so, the question is, how do you go about doing that? Are there, mechanisms to do that is maybe the first question, but then maybe how do you go about sort of enabling that information and knowledge to actually get disseminated? And I might turn to Thomas first on this, because I believe, you're interested in this idea too of sort of translating that knowledge so into a useful format.
Yeah, can you frame the question again?
So I think the question is getting to what Francine brought up too. So I think there's a high level, and then there's, I think, the micro level that I'll turn to maybe Francine, Cristina, and Delphine about, which is, how do you actually, what are the mechanisms to get the knowledge that's being generated on the ground in our discussion on this stakeholder engagement or conflict resolution to other practitioners, so people are actually learning from each other and learning from those mistakes or learning from what worked.
I mean, one thing that comes to my mind is doing really high quality program evaluation. So on the front end, designing a program or project that can be evaluated, and then having, in terms of roles for academics or people who are academically trained, having really good evaluators. It's mostly my wife who actually is an expert in this area. She works for Mathematica, and once you do a PhD in statistics and you apply that to a particular field, there is a world of difference between having someone like Mathematica evaluate your performance versus, having the organization themselves having some surveys at the end and asking the participants, how well something went. I just saw there's a huge distinction in terms of learning lessons and applying them across other practitioners. Just having great evaluations that are really rich and in depth. It's not my particular area, but from what I've seen others do, I think that's one way in which those lessons learned, both failures and successes, can be communicated.
Cristina, I might turn this question to you if you could maybe talk about, I mean, I'm assuming you, like, with amongst your team, you obviously sort of share what works and what doesn't, but maybe if you could talk about that even, amongst other teams within WCS, and then maybe take it another level up, and whether or not you share that outside of WCS in terms of the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I feel like there isn't enough investment in actually the monitoring, evaluation, and learning associated with this kind of work. And partly, it's really interesting. It's almost like the end goal doesn't matter, and sort of documenting what works and didn't work. It's just get in there, get it done. And it makes me think of this Thomas Pynchon quote: if they get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. And I sort of think we're not asking the right questions, that this is an incredibly dynamic, incredibly complex body of work. And to Francine's point, there isn't sort of a well-established articulation of the do's and don'ts and best practices and how those are context dependent. And so I actually think investment in really learning, how do we monitor, evaluate, and learn through these processes, capture the stories, capture the data, and then share it out, I think is a really important, at least in my experience, an important question that hasn't been asked to the degree that it should have. And the other thing I will say is, I've been involved in monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or at least asking for investment to develop that for my work forever. And one of the areas that I really feel there's a research gap is, what are the transformational metrics? Especially in conservation, the transactional metrics are pretty easy to measure your progress against, but the transformational metrics, how somebody suddenly has agency, how somebody who didn't speak is suddenly out front and then runs for an office and becomes an elected official, whatever that storyline is, I think those transformational metrics are critical. And so how do you actually, without those, an investment in evaluation and learning, how do you tell the story of this work in a way that isn't just, my fish was this big? So I think we actually need to really dig into this and invest in it. Make it a priority.
I'm going to turn this over to Delphine and Francine. I know you've got your hands up probably to comment on this, but I also want you to maybe be a bit specific, but I think because we're always asking for more money, right? And so I think it's clear that there's resources needed for this. And I think more, in addition to resources, there also needs to be a space to do this work, right? In terms of taking the time to then be able to do that evaluation. So I'm curious, from your experiences, where would you envision that both the funding for this coming from, but also the space and time for you to be able to do that type of transformational sort of knowledge sharing? So we'll go to Delphine first, but please feel free to comment what you were originally going to comment on too.
Tough questions. And I wanted to give an example that we heard actually recently from Riley, was a speaker at the previous session. I've been supporting Target Malaria on trying to learn from their experience with the model and see how they can improve it, hearing from the communities, but also from a broader set of stakeholders. And so we reached out to experts, and she said something that I thought was a fantastic idea. She was saying, well, you're having a lot of these processes where you try to learn internally as a project and as practitioners, but have you ever considered having an academic there, like an ethnologist or an anthropologist, looking at this discussion and doing that work kind of silently, trying to see what are the questions there, what are the questions for evaluation and for monitoring. And I thought this was a very interesting idea because I used to do monitoring and evaluation when I worked in development and livelihood. And one issue that projects face is how you find the time to evaluate and for it to be meaningful. I've written so many evaluation reports that have ended up not being used or read, and then you see the same issues being raised afterwards. So how do you find the time, and how do you have something that isn't staged? Not that, you know, projects have a wrong intention, but when you have an evaluation, you stop all your work, and then you have this question, you go to stakeholders, you ask them, and so in a way you create this bias of just having an evaluator. And I quite like the idea, though of course there could be this bias of having this person, but I think if you work on a more longitudinal way and you have someone like that who could build trust with a project and witness different moments where you might not think there is something to learn, but actually in the way you work together in the discussion, there's far more learning than you would ever identify. So it's not my idea, it's coming from Riley, but I thought this was a very interesting point. And in terms of funding, I think, and I think I can say for Todd that they've been for evaluation funding, and the issue has been more finding the time to do it. But I think it should be core to any funding for engagement should have an evaluation component. And if you look at good practices for development aid, evaluation and monitoring is embedded in the core.
Delphine, you broke up there in that last part of your answer, which I think was actually quite important. So maybe turn your camera off and kind of maybe repeat that part about the funding and how that
funding. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was saying that when I worked in development aid, the funding for monitoring evaluation was embedded into core funding, and it's actually an OECD good practice for funders requirement. And so, and as I said, I think for Target Malaria, they've been fortunate enough that their funders have supported evaluation, though it's always hard to find the time to implement them. But I think this should be in research, it should be like in any other field, it should be embedded. If you fund engagement, you should fund the evaluation of it. You shouldn't have to go somewhere else. It should be part of good funders practice. And so if we have funders here, calling for them to apply this good practice, copy the OECD criteria on good donorship.
Francine, please go ahead.
Yeah, so more rich, good discussion here. So we've been sort of developing, advancing, testing our monitoring and evaluation internally for several years now, constantly trying to learn more, apply, test, et cetera. So some challenges and some whatnot. So one, back to the question from our audience is, it is hard, I will say, it is hard to document because so much of what I do rests on the confidentiality of what's happening. And so there's kind of our obvious, more explicit methodology that people look, like, oh, look, she facilitated a big meeting. And then there's sort of what I'm doing in my engagement with that system and the behind the scenes stuff, so that, because my goal is always to be able to leave that system and, kind of to Delphine's point, create a process that the people who are embedded in that system, they have that trust, they move that forward. So there's always that transition to the functioning of the society without the outsider coming in. But the confidentiality is tough in being able to document this. And then getting to the monitoring evaluation, and your issue of time and space, that is a challenge. So we have worked with people in the peace building field. We have hired consultants, right? But we can only afford to hire this much, to try and help us figure it out. But there's definitely a mutual learning element that has gone on over the last several years in CPeace and the folks that we've brought in to help us with monitoring and evaluation, because they need to learn what it is we do and how we do it and our methodology, so that they can help us then monitor and learn from that. There is an element of, and certainly in my work, you can't prove a lot of our work, but you can't prove a negative. So I work in places where there is some evidence that if the work that occurred didn't occur, violence would have occurred. But I can't give attribution, right? Maybe influence, but I'm also not going to say it because it's just going to introduce blame into the system. So I'm not going to document that. I'm not going to report on it. I'm not going to tell you what case it was in or cases, right? But they can't prove the negative makes it really hard to say, well, what impact did it have, right? Because conflict is part of society's continual progression. So there's always going to be conflict. It's never going to look all neat and pretty, kumbaya-ish. It's going to be messy, but are those conditions there where people can continue to work together and solve problems over time? And we also monitor for what's going out. What is the ripple effect, right? Is it moving a virtuous cycle out into that system? So there's that element. And then the other element that's challenging is I'm in a case for, whether it's, 5 months or I'm in a case for 3 years. It doesn't really, ultimately, it doesn't matter what the system looks like at the end of 5 months or 3 years, because we're all playing the infinite game. This is about having people, fish, wildlife, habitats, all the rest of it for the long, long term. So if someone says to me, hey, was your case a success? I say, I don't know, come to me in 10 years, come to me in 20 years. Let's see what it looks like. And then you have to measure that against what it could have looked like if there wasn't an intervention. So it's a lot harder than I think it absolutely has to happen. We have chosen to invest our time, energy, resources to do it. We've never had funding to do it, or almost never had funding to do it. And I think more work needs to be done. And so how do you carve out that time? It's really hard. We're on a hamster wheel, right? We take a case and that actually then gives us the funding to then keep going to take on the next case. But we want to move a much larger hamster wheel, maybe not quite a hamster wheel. We want to move a much larger movement forward that is really advancing the whole field, right? So that's a challenge. And then to the issue of what are you monitoring, evaluating for? I got an email yesterday from someone who works on shark conflict in Australia, and she's gone through our capacity building. We do a fundamentals in conflict transformation and an advance. She's gone through both of them. She's done amazing work. Australia is having the worst shark attacks or shark bites incidents that I think maybe they've ever had, or it's really, really bad. They have in Australia, they have these groups that are called bite clubs. So these are people who have survived shark bites, or their family members were killed by shark bites. She is a government official who is basically, the government is being blamed for these sharks for not solving it. And she emailed me and said, the bite club just gave her a bike club jumper, sweatshirt, or sweater that we call in America. And she was like, oh my God, the bike club, this is this precious symbolic thing of you are one of us. And they gave it to their enemy, to the adversary, to the government official in the Ministry of Fisheries because of the amazing work that she's done using conflict transformation. How do you monitor and evaluate that? Do you write on a little monitoring evaluation thing? Got a sweatshirt from Bike Club? Woohoo, right? But that's the story. That is the moment that she has built, that trust that transcended individuals, it's transcending groups, and it's making that society better able to function so that they can have these large predators and surfers can have their way of life. It's tough.
That's great. It's a club you probably don't want to be a member of, but also great that they were able to build those relationships. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to put this one question from the chat specifically to Cristina, and it's really about, how do you involve sort of scientists in these engagement questions? And so I wonder if you could talk about the work that you do in terms of how you bring in, the conservation scientists or the wildlife biologists into the engagement process, and are there do's and don'ts in terms of how to engage the scientific community in that engagement work on the ground, or vice versa, right? How do you bring sort of the community maybe into the scientist world as well?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna tackle the latter first because it's my favorite, and something we've really wrestled with. So particularly our work with Indigenous communities, just working with my team to talk about the importance of braiding different ways of knowing and drawing on different knowledge systems. And it's sort of I accuse myself of being kind of arm wavy about it. And I realized that, you got to walk your own talk. If you are telling folks to show rather than tell, you've got to do this. And so we've actually co-created a process with a fabulous Kainai woman, Kainai First Nation from Canada, to essentially craft a process where you talk about, the values that underpin the why, how of bringing together different knowledge systems. There's sort of a whole school of thought called two-eyed seeing that really recognizes that there's different ways of knowing, and when do you draw on both eyes, once you draw on one over the other. So I think there really is a lot of work to do to demonstrate that science can mean many things. And so in this process, we're talking about things like, it's not just even defining what science is, it's really, if we can do this right, we might ask different research questions. We might apply different methodologies. We might therefore have different outcomes. And then there's a whole conversation about how you implement that data. So that's just a really practical process that we've engaged in to try and figure out how we engage science in a new way, in a novel way. But honestly, I think there's also a translation question that Thomas has talked about a lot. And, for example, to talk about our bison work for a little bit, one of the things that we were contracted to do was to look at the genetics of federal bison herds. And for many of my tribal family, colleagues, partners, their perspective was, if it looks like a buffalo, smells like a buffalo, it's a buffalo. And it raised a whole lot of issues, as you can imagine, around blood quantum. Are you native? Are you a buffalo? And what's really cool, and again, these are those funny sort of bike club stories. Now I was just at an Intertribal Buffalo Council meeting last week in Denver with, over 74 tribes. And my lead scientist was presenting her population viability analysis to the tribe, to see if the different tribes, to see if there was interest in doing something similar to understand the genetics of their herds and how they could manage for genetics. And I would say that some of it is she's a really skilled communicator and translator. She tells stories rather than presenting her data. So she's really conscious of audience, framing, the importance of stories in that cultural context. The other piece is that we've been working with ITBC, with the Buffalo Council for a long time. So there's trust. And even in that, I had some of my partners come to me and say, should I really go to this and listen? Even though it's my own staff. And I'm like, please do. And then tell me everything that you heard and didn't hear and liked and didn't like. So I think there's multiple ways to do this. I hope that I'm answering your question, but I think it really does get back to getting people together and then figuring out how we can talk to each other in a way that there's translation and there's understanding. And I think there's a little bit of, if I might say it, I think there's a need to be a hell of a lot more humble and dial down the arrogance of, knowledge and data, and kind of come more from a place of everything that we don't know and all the blind spots that we inherently have and all the assumptions that we come into the world with. And there's just something about bringing it back down to our humanness and our foilability, if that's a word. I don't think it is, but I just invented it. That I think opens this space for everyone to really come together and co-create solutions and draw the best of the best in creating those. So hopefully that answers your question, Todd.
That was great. So we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask Francine and Delphine to maybe keep the response to this to about 30 seconds or so, because I want to then give you all a chance to give any final thoughts, and I might pose a final thought question. So Francine, go ahead.
Okay, really quick, just want to absolutely echo the humility thing. I think part of what corrupts good science is the lack of humility around it. I think these need to be integrated, right? I think a lot of times people want to separate it because they're actually afraid of where stakeholders are going to go. So they want to separate the stakeholders from the scientists who really know what the hell they're doing. And I think that's wrong, because I think there has to be that integration, there has to be that humility and that co-creation, so that you actually do get policy or programs that are based in science, all the diverse kinds of science there are, but that you also build a receptivity for whatever the outcome is and the ability for a community to stick with it, or community writ large. And that means there's less of the either or and more of an and focus. And then just getting to Abha's comment in the box here, I don't think there is a huge difference between public health and wildlife conservation, because the common element here are human beings, and human beings are in all of these.
Delphine.
Yeah, and just back to this question, and I think Rahul's question in the chat, I think it's important that engagement practitioners and academics see themselves as translators and interpreters, so they facilitate for community members to be able to explain their concerns or their expectations to scientists, and for scientists to know how to communicate, and I don't like the word communicate, but how to engage and have real dialogue, forget their jargon, identify when it's a jargon, find a common language. And in this, I know I wanted to share the example of Maria's work on the glossary that they co-created with the community. So they created that as the engagement team, but they involved the scientists in seeing, okay, what are the words that are actually complicated, that we need a common language, and rather than just focusing on the word, how do we explain it? And having this work with scientists of saying, okay, explain it to me in simple terms, forget that it has to be the exact name of the protein or whatever. Explain it to me that I can understand it. And that's part, I think, of the humility and of the dialogue. So I always like thinking of engagement as a translation between different words and interpretation.
So Thomas, I want to give you an opportunity to give any maybe final thoughts, and then I'll turn this back over to Royden. So Thomas, please go ahead.
I'll cede my time. This has been a rich discussion, and thank you for having me on the panel.
All right, so I want to give my thanks to everyone. This has been a fascinating conversation. I wish we had 5 hours or maybe all day to talk about this. So thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us today for this important conversation. So Royden, over to you.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you very much. And along with Todd, the moderator, I'd like to thank Francine again, Tom, Delphine, Cristina, for considering the independence needed for effective stakeholder engagement in general, and with an eye toward research and development of gene drive technology for societal benefit. This marks the last in our panel series. We always share our gratitude at the end for our wonderful moderator and panelists, but I wanted to say a bit more. This series came about during a pandemic affecting the entire world and each one of us. Besides the individuals you have seen on the Zoom panels, we've had extensive support to make this happen. First, with Karen Tudis, who elected to partner with the GBIRD Consortium and examine stakeholder engagement in depth. Karen's passion and creativity is driving the Gene Drive Research Forum in very productive ways. I would also like to thank Island Conservation, who supports me and actively prevents extinctions as a part of their normal operations. Fred Gould and the Genetic Engineering and Society Center for hosting me as a visiting scholar and keeping a critical eye on the risks and potential held in genetic technology. Along with Fred, others in the GES include Jason and Katie, along with Sarah Hartley in Exeter in their consultation for putting these panels together. Mike Santos and the rest of the team at FNIH and the Gene Convene for supporting the Gene Drive Research Forum in our attempt to move the field forward in a positive manner. I am confident that we as an engaged community will continue to catalyze actual and meaningful research into the potential for gene drive technology to restore ecosystems, save human lives, and prevent hunger. There will be an announcement soon regarding the next exciting endeavor of the Gene Drive Research Forum. FNIH is partnering with McMaster University to examine ethical issues in the area of gene drive research. More to come on that front. Thank you very much.